Before I introduce Martha, I would very much like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we meet today. I recognise their diverse and ancient culture and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Martha Hall Kelly is an author joining us from Connecticut. I knew I would struggle with that one. Connecticut in the USA. Her first novel, Lilac Girls, was published in 2016 and became a New York Times bestseller within its first week. Lost Roses was published in 2019 and was the prequel to Lilac Girls, followed by Sunflower Sisters, her latest release, which we are discussing today. And these three books form the Carolyn Ferriday series. So I've read the book and I'm just going to welcome Martha now.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so much fun.
As we were discussing before everyone else came on, this book was a real eye-opener for me. I knew nothing about the Civil War. I did not know where Maryland is located. And I'd never heard of the Underground Railway. I've been on a real journey. And can you give everyone an outline of the story and how you came to write it?
Sure. Well, I'm glad that it was a good journey for you. It started all the way back with Lilac Girls. I don't know if any of your participants have read Lilac Girls, but back in 2000, I just visited a museum near my house in Connecticut, a house museum, which I love old houses. And I was the only person on the tour that day of Carolyn Feriday's house. And I discovered this incredible story of these women Polish Catholic women that had been operated on at Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany. And Carolyn Ferriday, the woman that owned that home, had helped them and brought them to the United States from Poland after they had really horrible surgeries done to them at Ravensbrück, experimental surgeries. And so I found this kind of hidden history at this house called the Bellamy Faraday House in Connecticut. Now I live very close to it, about 10 minutes away. But when I found that story, I couldn't believe that it had gotten lost in time the way that it had. And Carolyn Ferriday she's passed away now, sadly. She died in the 90s, but I felt like she had so much to offer as a role model. And I just started investigating her life down in the archives underneath the house. And what used to be the old root cellar is now the archive. So I used to just go down there and I was just fascinated with her. I love gardening and she had tons of gardening books. So I just got to know her that way. And I never thought about writing a novel or a book. I had been trained as a journalist in college, but I ended up writing TV commercials instead. And I never even thought about writing a book until my husband and I went out to dinner with a couple, and the female half of the couple, her name is Betty Sargent. We just started talking about all this research that I was doing about Caroline and the rabbits, the so-called rabbits that were experimented on. And she said, I don't know if Mike told you, but I'm a book editor. And I said, no, he did not tell me that. And she said, all I need is a chapter. You should write this story. It would make a great novel. And I just thought, how do you write a novel? That's crazy. But then I moved down to Atlanta, Georgia, which is even further south from Maryland. It's way down by Florida. And my husband got a job with the Weather Channel down there. And I had no friends. And I was this Yankee lady from the North and didn't really know anybody. And went through a Starbucks drive-through and got a caffeinated beverage by mistake. And the story just started coming out and I just started writing it. It was very weird. And I added 2 more points of view. So it was Caroline as one point of view and then Kasha, one of the so-called rabbits, and then Herta Oberhauser, who was the Nazi doctor that operated on them. So it took me a long time to write that book, but yeah, I didn't think anyone was going to read it because who am I? Nobody. But it just became this crazy popular book. And then, so that's when I went back to Random House and I said, I'd really like to tell the story of her mother, Eliza. So I wrote Lost Roses, and that was about the Bolshevik Revolution and how her mother helped a different group of women. They were so-called white Russians that lost everything in the revolution and ended up in America with nothing. And then I went even further back in time, and that is Sunflower Sisters. And that is Caroline's great grandmother, Jane Eliza's family. And they were staunch abolitionists and a really interesting family, I thought, because I had read all their letters that were down in the archives. There were 1,000 letters to and from Eliza and her 8 children. She had 7 daughters and 1 son. And it was a very tragic life, if you know, since you've read the book about Eliza's husband, how he died at sea, and she had all these children to bring up on her own. I mean, that alone, I think, is incredible. I mean, I have 3 children and I could barely do that. And to have 8, I don't know. But yeah, so that was Sunflower Sisters, and that came out in March. And I'm still pinching myself that all of this has happened and that people have been, the outpouring of love and support from readers has just been amazing.
It is an amazing story, and you do have 3 very strong female characters, and you write from the different points of view. You've got Gemma, who's the slave at Peeler Plantation, and May, who's the landholder of the plantation, and Georgie, a staunch abolitionist nurse. So what is the role in each of these characters for the story?
Well, I started, it was hard choosing the point of view character from the Woolsey family, from all of those girls, because there were 7 of them. And I read all those letters and I fell in love with all of them, frankly. They were all really accomplished. Their mother was a strong advocate for female education, which at the time in the 1860s, I think everywhere in the world it was unusual for women to be educated the way that these girls were. And so it was hard to choose. They were all very smart. They did wonderful things, all of them. And so, but I chose Georgie. She was the middle child, and I'm a middle, so I kind of related to her, I guess. But she was also, oh, you are too? That's so funny. I think we're very resourceful, but she always had the right thing in her pockets. And that really appealed to me because as a nurse, it wasn't nurses like today where you start an IV or you give a shot. They were backing up the doctors and feeding the men a prescribed diet. And they had to be Johnny on the spot with everything. And I just felt like that is so not me. And I admire that so much. And so I really wanted to understand, what made her tick. She also had, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but a love interest in the book named Frank Bacon, who was a real person. And she talks a lot about Frank Bacon, who was a surgeon, in her letters. And I thought that would be a really interesting little, relationship to have. And she also wrote a book called 3 Weeks at Gettysburg. And it is the tiniest little book. It's about this big. And I ordered it from Amazon and I expected like a regular book. And then this came. I mean, it is literally like a pack of cards or something, but it's a wonderful little book. And it talks about her, her time when she was nursing soldiers down in Gettysburg, which is in Pennsylvania, which is on your map, Kathy. And is that our cheat sheet? Yes, it's the middle. I'm horrible at geography, so I appreciate a good map. So that was Georgie. And then the other characters, I thought, well, they were such staunch abolitionists, these Woolsey women. And I mean, they didn't just talk the talk, they really were abolitionists. They carried in their pockets. I talk about this in, oh no, I can't find it. I have my little, my slave coin. I don't know what happened to it. I'll look for it while we're talking. But they had these slave coins that say, am I not a woman? And it's an enslaved woman with their hands up and, with chains. They all carried one of those in their pockets, which I think is just amazing. And even though their father had been a sugar merchant, and that was, a real blot on their reputations in a way, they did everything they could to try and make up for that, and worked at the colored orphanage asylum, which it was called back then. So I really felt like I needed to showcase abolitionism and have an enslaved character, and that is Gemma, and she is a house slave. I really wanted to show how, the real workings of an enslaved household, and I wanted to make her in the house, which would separate her from the rest of her family. I wanted to give her an intact family as well, because it was very unusual to have an intact slave family, because so often the slave owners just would sell off, if they had a debt, they'd sell a slave or they'd buy a slave. And, there wasn't a lot, there was lip service given to it, but there wasn't a lot of care given to keeping families intact. Hers was intact somewhat. She had a mother and father, and her sister was lent out to another plantation. But even on the plantation, she was in the house, and her parents and the other slaves were in cabins. So, that I was interested in that separation and what that was all about. And so I had Gemma, and I wanted to make her educated. I wanted her aunt, not her Aunt Tandy Rose, but a woman named Aunt Tandy Rose, who originally owned the plantation, to teach her how to read and write, because I thought that would be interesting, because, it was against the law to do that with slaves. But I thought it would be interesting if she were educated and Anne May, the woman that owned the plantation, was not. I thought that would be kind of an interesting dynamic, which I think it ended up being in the book, because I'm struggling with how to not give spoilers, but
I know.
that happens. Things happen because of that dynamic. And then the third character, of course, is Anne May Wilson Watson, who is a very spoiled 25-year-old owner of these human beings and this giant plantation, which is tobacco plantation. And she is spoiled and just not a very nice person. I think you understand that when you meet her mother, Zaretha, and you go, oh, okay, that's where it all comes from. But Anne May's had a hard life too. People, they hate Anne May. It's so funny because I didn't really, I thought I gave her some redeeming qualities, but everybody I talked to says, no, she's just awful. But yeah, those are the three characters.
Yeah, and like you say, Anne May, I actually didn't hate her. I just felt it was her circumstance. They were doing the best that they had with the information that they had and the knowledge and experiences that they had at the time. And they are like, one of the things that really struck me was the fashion and how you used fashion to distinguish your characters. So Gemma had a very particular conscious of the fashion, and she was a seamstress, and she made the bonnets, and I would love to see one of those bonnets because they're just beautiful. And Anne May is all about the latest fashion and dressing up and all of that kind of thing. And then Georgie is like, she takes care of herself, but I think one of her sisters was didn't care about what her clothes were all worn out and stuff, so long as she got to go and help the orphans. So it's very much the fashion is used as a status symbol.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I love using fashion in historical fiction. I think that so much historical fiction in the old days was written by men, and fiction in general. I mean, history in general. But I think men skip over fashion in general, at least the women's fashion. They, talk about the men's clothes. So I think it's a really interesting historical point, the clothes, because I think it tells you a lot about what was happening at the time. Up north, they were wearing very plain clothes. They were more cities. They were nurses. They couldn't wear a hoop skirt, for example, whereas in the South, they had a lot more room to, be able to wear one of those giant hoop skirts, and they were enormous and very dangerous, by the way, because they used to catch on fire and thousands of women died. I had no idea before I started my research that so many women died because, it's vanity, these giant hoop skirts, because basically, if you've got a small waist and you can get that through corseting, the rest of it is hidden under this giant hoop skirt. So they loved their hoops. And but so up north, they during the Civil War on the ships, for example, the hospital ships, they couldn't wear hoops because they had to go in and out of the beds, and they were there for business more. And then of course the enslaved, they were very depending on the plantation. I got into fashion a little too much maybe in my research, but on some plantations, the slaves made their own clothes. On others, the mistresses made them for them. Some of them cut down their own clothes for the slaves, when they were done with something. So it was fascinating. I love fashion myself. Um, I, I, and I love putting it in every one of my books. I think it just adds another dimension, especially because most of my readers are women. And but even the men that read my books really, really love the fashion. And my agent, especially with this book, she said, "You have to put a lot of fashion in it, please." So I had to please her.
Yeah, and you did, but you also put the fashion in for the men, and I know you the oh, I've forgotten his name, but the person who owned the shop who was associated with Anne May, I don't want to give too
Oh,
much away.
Jubal
Yes.
Small.
So he was a very fashion conscious person, but then you also drew attention as the importance of the uniforms of the different
Oh,
armies as well too. So how important and
wow,
significant that was.
you really picked up on the fashion. That's so great. I love it when that happens because my grandmother was a seamstress and I grew up around her and making clothes and things. So I really love it. So I'm so glad that you appreciated that.
Yeah, I certainly did. And what another thing I picked up about the Civil War was on the plantation you had um, Anne May's husband going off to fight for the North and her brother going off to fight for the South. Now, was that a common kind of thing that happened?
I don't know if it was common, but it definitely happened. And it wasn't just family members fighting against family members, it was friends fighting against friends. That I think was probably more common. And actually shooting each other and killing each other. It was so tragic. And the actual battle that those two fight in, many more than usual battles, it was friends against friends because it was very close communities that were fighting each other. So yeah, that was an actual battle. And yeah, poor Fergus, he's so long suffering, being married to Anne May. And then of course it's so tragic what happens to her brother. I loved her, but I hated killing him off. I love that character so much. My kids are so funny. They read first drafts and they lobby me to keep certain people alive. It's like, no, I'm sorry. That person has to, you know, like Celeste, for example. They loved
Ah,
Celeste and were so sad about her. But I think once it's someone's time, a fictitious character, they just have to
yeah,
face the inevitable.
definitely. And just even talking of Celeste, one thing that I wasn't quite so aware of was the barbaric treatment of slaves
Mm.
during that period, and you do, and the great lengths that the abolitionists take to secret them out of out of those dangerous situations, out of the South, and through the Underground Railway. How difficult was it to write those kind of scenes?
You mean the more brutal things?
Yeah.
It was hard. It comes out in other ways, I have to be honest. And the same was true for the other books, because Lilac Girls takes place in a concentration camp, a big part of it. And the other, the Bolshevik Revolution. Those are really hard scenes. And, you find yourself, like one time when I picked my son up from school, he said, Mom, it's kind of crabby, maybe. And he said, Mom, have you been writing Herta chapters? And I said, yes, I have. But so I think it kind of comes out in other ways. But yeah, especially when it comes to things about children. At the concentration camp, there were some things about children that's really, really hard for me. But on the other hand, when I toured Ravensbrück and when I went around the plantation and when I went to Russia to research the Bolshevik Revolution, I have the ability to just focus on that and just write it. It isn't until after that I go back when I feel more sad about it. One time I was driving with my husband on a long trip and I was listening to the Lilac Girls audiobook, and I started crying at one point. And my husband said, you wrote this, why are you crying? And I just thought, well, I'm experiencing it in a whole different way. I think when you have a voice actor, and I'm just as vulnerable to it as anyone is. Just because I wrote it doesn't mean that I can't be moved by it. So it isn't until after sometimes that I feel the horror of it and the pain. But while I'm writing it, for some reason, I'm immune to that. I don't know. Maybe I have deep psychological problems. I'm not sure, but it works. It's working for me.
Yeah. They're hard scenes, but very very well written. I really thought that they had a place in that story. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was the reason why I had the map was because I didn't know where any of the places were. So this is my map. What struck me was the closeness of it all, how close everybody is in that space and time, and the whole idea of the Civil War. The reasoning behind that really drives the story as well.
Absolutely. Well, there was the North and the South, and I chose Maryland because it was a border state, what they call a border state. And it means, there's a Mason-Dixon line. This may be too much, a geography for us. I'm not a geography person either, but there's a thing called the Mason-Dixon line that runs between the North and the South in the United States. And Maryland was a border state because it was on the border of that. It was almost in the South, but Lincoln was very smart, the president, and he knew that Maryland is so close to Washington, D.C. I mean, it surrounds it. If Maryland were to go with the South, the war would have been lost by the North. So what he did was he allowed Maryland to keep their slaves, even though they were fighting with the North, technically. But so I thought that was really interesting. Another state was Kentucky that did the same thing. Because they, in an instant, if their slaves were taken away, could have said, okay, forget it, we're going to go with the South, and then the war would be over. But yeah, everything was very close together in the book, and I needed to do that because they had horse and carriage, and it just kind of worked out that way, that I didn't put the plantation in the South, because they needed to all, in literature, they call it a crucible, that you keep your characters very close together, and that way they can interact and have conflict. Because if they were all the way down in Georgia, it would take them forever to take a horse and carriage all the way up to, say, New York City. So even those, it looks close on a map, but in those days, that would have been, from one to the other, would have been at least a 1 or 2 day journey. We forget, with a car, they couldn't just jump in a, Range Rover and go to Gettysburg.
And I think they used boats quite a bit as their transport as well.
Yeah, especially the hospital ships. I had so much fun researching the hospital ships because I didn't know anything about those. And it was fascinating the way that they were just floating hospitals. And there's a whole system of rivers in Maryland, and they would wait. I mean, they could hear the battle happening and they would just wait there. And um, the ambulances and other manners of conveyance would bring all the wounded down to the shores, and they would put as many as they could onto the hospital ships, and those would go out to the ocean and then transfer them onto other boats, and they would go up north to Massachusetts and New York and take the wounded up there. But they couldn't take everybody, so they had to kind of triage that. And it turned out the women in the book, the Woolsey sisters that became nurses, they were such good nurses that they were needed on the most intensive boats. They weren't allowed to be on the boats that went all the way up to New York. They had to be right there at the battle. And so they had a really interesting life. I think they were actually not disappointed, but it was a letdown for them after the war was over because they were so critical to the mission. And, without any men in the city of New York, they were all off fighting, or most of them that didn't pay to get out of the battle. Their status was kind of elevated. I don't know if you got that from the book, but I felt like once all the men came back, they were like, kind of put back in their place, which I think they didn't like that much.
Yeah, and I mean, 8 Brevoort Place is a very significant, and place is important in stories, but their home, is it real? Is it where they really lived?
Yeah, absolutely. That street is still there. And I'm not 100% sure. It's called something different now, but that street is still there. So I'm not sure which of the brownstones it is. But yeah, I've identified the street and walked up and down it. And at the time, it was a very fancy area. Now it's in what's called the East Village. That may be too much information for you all. But in New York City, it's way south. Manhattan is an island, and it's way down at the bottom, which has now become very trendy again. Soho, I don't know if you've heard of that. There's trendy areas in New York City now, and it's just funny that the area that they had, 8 Brevoort Place, is now in the trendy area, but for a very long time, the fashionable area went north up to Central Park, and but now it's very trendy again.
And the little cards that right in the very, very start of the book, there's the little cards that the Weasley women give out. Did they actually give out those cards to people?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think they probably did in Australia too. I think back pre-Victorian age and in the Victorian age, you would call and have calling cards, and you would just leave, even in Jane Austen's time, you would just leave a card on a silver plate, and people just knew that you had been there. Just because calling on other people was almost a form of recreation. Even if no one was home, you would come in, you had a special bonnet that you wore, you had special clothes that you wore, this whole kind of elaborate dance of you come in and you call, and if someone's there and they allow you to come in, you have tea, or so they didn't have a whole lot going on in their lives, I think. And this was a way to kind of, not fill up time, but it's what they did socially. Instead of watching, TikTok videos and Netflix series, they were out, handing out their engraved cards.
And so the Weasley women, though, they right at the very start, they give their card to a slave. Is that something that would have happened?
That whole first chapter is true. I don't know if you realize that, but it's from one of the letters. Yeah. the Woolsey women were in Charleston, South Carolina. That's even, it's even further down than Georgia, down by Florida. And they were just visiting, and they happened upon a slave auction on a side street. Today, that same slave auction is still there, and it's a really beautiful museum dedicated to slavery and the horrors of slavery. And it's such a sad museum. I mean, they have manacles, chains that are child size. It's just a very, very sad place. But anyway, I thought it was the perfect place to start the book, because in their letters, they talk about going to that slave market, and they weren't allowed in because they were women. And they look through the bars and they talk to a woman whose family is being sold off. Her children, her husband was sold off a long time ago, but they're selling off her children. And it's just, that to me was such a sad, just a horrifying thing. And the woman from the conversation that they show in the letters is very kind of sanguine about it. She says her husband was sold off and there go her children. I mean, she wasn't screaming and crying, or, any of us would be, reacting. But what made it even more sad was that she just had to accept it. There was no recourse at all. And so anyway, that is all true. I have her giving the card to that woman because it's a spoiler, but it has to show up later. And I don't know if that is not historically accurate to what happened with the Woolseys, but that's why it's nice to write a novel. And she gives this enslaved woman her card, and it works its way into the rest of the story.
Yeah, it's a very significant part of the story for sure. Like you mentioned, the romance for Georgie with Frank Bacon, on a bit of a lighter note, for me it was both beautiful and frustrating. It was a time when securing a marriage before 30 was essential for survival, and you challenged that, and Georgie's seeing love as marriage is encouraged as a love choice, and her education was valued. Do you think that was radical for the time?
Oh, absolutely. Her mother, Jane Eliza, that was a love match with Mr. Woolsey. And I think she encouraged her daughters, you can get married if you want, or you cannot. It's up to you. And the two oldest never married. And it's funny because a lot of the Frank Bacon things are true, taken from letters, because they all had such good senses of humor. She talked a lot about his beard, how she hated his beard. She called it his little king's beard. And when he brought her roses one time, she told her sister, I was happy to see the roses. He could leave and march off to war as long as he left the roses, or something. I was just like, oh my God. I mean, very similar to how girls feel today, kind of. She just was not that into him until he had another lady love. And then she was kind of like, oh, wait a minute, maybe I do like him. I mean, it's kind of a cliche, but it's also basically what really happened in their relationship. And because they had known each other since they were very young. And I just loved the interplay of them. And I know it's frustrating because, those romances where they almost get together and then they don't, it's very frustrating. But it really was true in this case. And we can't really say what happens, but I think it's interesting what happens to Mary later in the book. That plays into it as well. Her dear sister Mary, who they called the beauty of the family, which I think is so funny, because nowadays we wouldn't say that. I don't think in most families, I think you want all your kids to feel equally seen and appreciated, but they did. They were very proud of Mary, the beauty. And she really was the beauty, though. I have to say, she was stunningly beautiful. They've got like 100 pictures of her in the archives. And she was an incredible poet and wasn't allowed to tell anybody. And by today's standards, her poetry went viral, I guess you would say. It was carried in the pocket of every soldier, North and South, when they went into battle, because she had written this incredible poem about what it was like to die in battle and see God. And so, but she was never allowed, she signed it anonymous, and people assumed it was a man. So she was never allowed to say that it was her that wrote it. So that, and to the day she died, she never was allowed to admit that she was this really talented poet. So I've always thought that was very kind of tragic. And her story is kind of caught up with Frank Bacon too.
And your research for it, you've mentioned like the archives and the letters and going to different places. Obviously the fashion, the slavery, there's just so many topics that you cover, the war, and nursing. How did you keep it on track? How did you manage that writing process?
Well, I learned early on from Lilac Girls that I had to do an outline. And do you want to see my outline?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. It's kind of worse for wear, but I take pieces of paper and I put them all together and like I tape them all together. I know it looks like an anaconda or something. It's so long.
I love it.
But I don't know if you can see, but there's 3 phases to it, and it goes from top to bottom. It's on the top, it's Georgie, and then it goes to a different character in the middle, and it's all done by date. And because it's really important with historical fiction that you, when I first started writing Lilac Girls, I didn't have an outline and I was all over the place. And you have to stay with, if Hitler is invading Poland in 1939, your scenes have to reflect that. So I figured that out finally. And now for historical fiction, actually any book, I do a big outline like that. And it really, it might take a couple of weeks or so and a lot of very tiny writing, but it just works for me. And that way I can have all my scenes and I know what all the scenes are. There are pantsers, they call them, that go by the seat of their pants, and there are plotters. I am definitely way in the plotter end of things because I plot it down to the scenes because I really like just being, I don't know, maybe I'm a control freak, but I really like having that control of knowing, and it changes, of course, all the, very much. Like, I don't think that outline is exactly what the book is, but at least you have a roadmap. It may not be the perfect roadmap, but it's security, at least for me, because the empty page is a scary place to be.
And I mean, the size of the book, it's quite a substantial book to write. How long did it take you to write?
About, oh gosh, without the research, the whole thing, about 5 years. But Lilac Girls took me 10 because I had to keep throwing things out. It's bad.
And what's next for you? What else have you got in the works coming up?
I wonder if I can move my, I don't know if you can see my bulletin board, all those people, those pictures over there. That's my next book. That is, I've gone backwards in time so much to write Sunflower Sisters and Lost Roses that I really wanted to go forward in time. And I finally got to. So my next book, it takes place in the 1950s. And I wrote a little blurb about it. And I have to read it because I haven't memorized it yet. It's called The Golden Doves, and it says, based on true events, 2 badass women resistance fighters who were imprisoned and tortured by the Nazis reunite after the war to bring their tormentors to justice. So it's post Ravensbrück, and an American girl who's half Jewish and a French girl were teamed up in the underground, and after they are liberated from Ravensbrück, they go after their Nazi tormentor, and they travel all over from South America, France, Rome, Vienna, not Australia. I didn't get to put Australia in there, but they go everywhere, and it's been really, really fun to write. It's more of a suspense novel maybe than some of, like Sunflower Sisters. And then after that comes a thriller, like an actual real thriller. And that's been fun because it's contemporary and it's one character, and it's set in my own house, which I don't know if that was so smart, because now I'm terrified to be in my own house. I'm really scared. My husband said, you can't even go in the basement now. We're gonna have to move. So, but it's worth it because it's been really, really fun. And it's set in my own town, which it says it's Massachusetts, but it's not. It's actually my town.
And when can we expect to see those hit the shelves?
Here, I think the paperback for Sunflower Sisters comes out right after Christmas. And then I think they're trying to do the Golden Doves, the second, the one about Ravensbrück, in the fall, I think. It's very mysterious. And then the other one the following year. So the thriller is the last. So that would be the 5th book, I guess. Yeah. I'm losing track.
Well, you've certainly done a brilliant job with the book. I really enjoyed it, and it actually encouraged me to go and find out a little bit more about what was actually causing, this civil war in the first place. And one of the things was, and I think Anne May's brother put it very kindly, yes, he doesn't agree in slavery, but it doesn't agree with it, but if he said the way that you release them, it can cause our whole economy to fail. And so these are the different reasonings. Like, you've got the very human reasoning about this is not the right thing, but if we do that, our country's going to actually fall over. And there's, you hear those arguments about things in change these days as well too. So it was really, really interesting to hear that perspective and to find out more about the Civil War and your website with the bonnets and all of those kind of things. So you have to go and have a look at the website, I must say, because there's, all the beautiful fashion things and stuff on there as well too. So if anyone's interested, I can highly recommend you jumping on there. I think on our Facebook group, someone had drawn a map of the Peeler plantation. So I don't know if anyone saw that, but someone had actually done a hand-drawn map so you could work out all the different places where people had gone. So thank you very much for writing that book. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. I loved it. I love those maps too. They're really fun.
But I just had one question. You mentioned thousands of women died from wearing the hoop skirts. For example, they caught fire. I was just wondering what other kind of accidents they actually did have.
Oh, it was terrible. Actually, it was all over the world. I'm sure it happened in Australia too. Fire was the biggest, because you can imagine, they didn't have electric lights yet, and they were often near the fire, and they were made from cellulose, and it was highly flammable, the underskirts. So they just would go up. Drowning, if you can believe it.
Wow.
Yes, women would be just walking and get a gust of wind would take them into the water, and they couldn't. I don't know if you ever it reminds me of The Piano, the movie The Piano.
Oh, yes.
And how she falls into the water, and she has that big skirt on, and she is almost drowned. I just rewatched that recently, and I just loved it so much. But yeah, drowning. I'm trying to think of other ways. There are some very unusual ways that people died with them. I can't think of them right now, but on the street, they often, like horses, their skirt would get, the hoop would get caught when a horse would go by or a carriage, and they'd be dragged to their death. I
how
know.
awful.
It's so awful. I actually wrote, Kathy talked about my website. On my website, marthahallkelly.com, there's a blog, and there's a blog post that's not that far down, maybe 2 posts down, that talks all about it if you have more interest. But yeah, I was just fascinated by, the vanity of it led to people actually dying, a lot of them.
Just not worth it.
I know.
No.
But to them it was.
Yeah.
To them, yeah, because they, it was fashionable. But what lengths do you go for fashion?
That's it. Well, thank you, Martha.
Thank you.
And I would imagine also too, the other thing, and in particular with the fire, is that because it's so distant, you don't actually feel it. You don't feel that skirt touch anything else.
Exactly. So it can be on fire and you don't even know it.
Thank
think
you
you did
very,
your
very
job
much
really
for
well.
joining us.
You did your job so well. You've answered everything.
Ah,
I have no questions because you were so thorough and wonderful. Thank you.
you're welcome. I really enjoyed it, and I've really enjoyed chatting with you today. And so everybody, thank you very much for joining us. Doesn't matter which order you read them.
Isn't that so funny? That's such a common question now that there's 3 of them. A lot of people are saying that if they haven't read the other ones, they want to start with this book and then go forward in time, which I think I haven't talked to anyone that's done that yet, but I bet that would be good. In each book, I have little, what they call Easter eggs. For example, in this one, they eat with the Woolsey silver. And then in Lost Roses, there's Woolsey silver. And then also Caroline, there's a plot line in Lilac Girls that has to do with the Woolsey silver. So it is kind of nice if you kind of are familiar with that before you go forward in time. But it's also fun to read them the way that they were written and the way that most of the world read them, which is Lilac Girls backwards in time. So really, they're standalone books. So it's not meant to be a series, really. You can read them in any order.
Yeah, I haven't read the other ones, and I didn't have a problem. There was nothing in here that I needed to know extra to enjoy the story or to find out any. It's all, standalone. You don't need to read the other ones. But that being said, I will be reading the other ones.
Well, that's very nice of you. And it's fun to see that Janine used to live in Rye. So that is next door.
Oh, is it? There
Yeah,
you
Rye.
go.
Yeah, Rye's very fancy, very nice town. So
Small world. It's getting smaller. We're getting closer.
It really is.
All right.
This is so much fun. Thank you
It's
for
been
having
great.
me. And hopefully I'll get to come back for the next book.
Oh, definitely, definitely. My people will talk to your people, and we'll get it all sorted.
We'll talk. Yeah.
We'll talk, yeah. And so if you haven't read any of Martha's books, jump onto the catalogue and have a look for them, and or check the ebooks. Otherwise, maybe if you are able to get out, see the lovely independent booksellers that we do have on the Central Coast. I'm sure that they'd love a visit from you guys as well too. So a big, big thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you, Martha.
Thank you, and stay safe. Bye,
Thank
Kathy.
you. You too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See you.